Okay, so this is a video that I've been thinking about for the last few days because with the internet, it's not the best place for nuance. Not in the sense that you can't find nuanced content, but that even the reaction to nuanced content tends to strip the nuance out of it in such a way that it tries to boil everything down to a simple kind of one sentence summary. And the problem with a lot of art, and particularly when you're dealing with literature, is that it's complicated, and the feelings that you get from it are complicated. And to talk about it with any kind of serious depth is to go against everything that the internet has kind of trained us to become in terms of algorithmic content and the way we consume things. So in that sense, to approach a video like this, not as a review, but as something more of a conversation, is unto itself difficult, especially when it's difficult to call it even like a criticism or an observation or just to have that single sentence summary. But what I want to talk about today really is my second attempt at reading Mircea Ceausescu's Blinding, and specifically why I struggle with it, because it took a lot of thinking and self-analyzing to really land on a reason, which, if you did see some of my earlier videos, I talked about making a video about my failure to read both this and In Search of Lost Time, and at the time, I thought it was because they were memoirs, and the memoir style wasn't meshing well with me. But while that is true to a very, very small extent, I'm finally able to sort of say what it is about this book that I struggle with so much. But even before I get into the struggle, I want to say that I have read Solenoid. I've read Solenoid twice. And it's a similar problem with Solenoid, where every time I think about Solenoid, I remember some really great imagery, some really interesting stuff, some really compelling arguments, and it feels like an overall good experience in hindsight. But every time I read Solenoid, it starts out usually okay, but gradually becomes torturous towards the middle. And it's really because it's a maximalist work of art, and I don't like maximalism. And this is where it comes down to it not being a simple matter of it's not just for me, which I've used in the past to describe kind of, let's say, certain storylines, certain plot lines, certain genres, to say, well, it's not for me, which to a certain extent is an easy dismissal to have. It's exactly that kind of one sentence sort of write-off that I was talking about earlier. But in the case of Blinding and Solenoid, I really wanted to do a more in-depth look at maximalism, both because it took me so long to accept that this is why I was struggling, not to accept, but to really appreciate that this is why I'm struggling with it, but also because it's not as simple as saying this isn't for me, because in a lot of ways, these books are exactly for me. The imagery, the societal observations, the way of looking at the world and whatnot, and the way the stories are like a puzzle, and a lot of what they're saying thematically, I really gel with and I really jive with. But the way in which it's portrayed, this maximalist prose, I just cannot get into. And I should say, like, I've always had a problem with a lot of postmodernist works, in part because of many of the ones that I read tend to be maximalist. Not always, but, when I think of maximalist prose, I always think of Infinite Jest. That's kind of my go-to. And this is why I sort of struggled with identifying or really accepting the description of Ceausescu as a maximalist writer, because I found I didn't find it to be as overwritten as like Infinite Jest. And I say overwritten, and already I feel like I've fallen into a trap of a word with so much bias associated with it, with a sort of inherent judgment to it. But what I kind of realized, I've listened to multiple people talk about Caratescu and why he's such a genius and why they really gel with his work. And when they describe and pull out certain excerpts, I don't necessarily agree 100% that it gives me the same emotional resonance, but I absolutely appreciate the kind of artistry in the prose to what they pull out. But the problem is, whenever I go and I read it, I never end up with the same emotions and the same feeling. And, on the one hand, it's easy enough to just say, okay, well, it's not for me. But specifically, why? And I can finally appreciate that the reason why is that in isolation, a lot of the sentences can be interesting, but put back to back, when you're really how I read, it ends up just my brain shuts off legitimately when I'm reading this work, because it's just description after description after description, with the plot really taking a back seat to these descriptions. And this is where I struggled for so long to identify the problem, because as I've said, with my Nosgard videos and some of my Murakami videos, I don't mind stories where characters stop and navel gaze. I like the surrealist elements. I like the magical realist elements. So it's like, on paper, everything about Caratescu's work should be something I like. So why have I been struggling with it? And it's just legitimately this maximalist prose where he will go on and on and on and on and on with a description. And I've seen one person call it purple prose, and I've seen people push back against that. And this is sort of seeing it from the outside, is sort of appreciating that struggle where, purple prose doesn't have a fixed definition, in the sense that, it's subjective. Everything in art is subjective. But I think particularly when it comes to describing prose, it's something that can be ultra subjective, to the point where it can be difficult to have a real conversation about it or to say anything definitive. Because in this instance, for the people who've read, whose videos I've watched, whose essays I've read, who love Caratescu's work, the exact maximalist writing, which for me makes it so impossible to focus on the story, to get engaged with it, is exactly what they connect with. And I think this goes beyond just, one man's trash is another man's treasure, or something like that. Well, I don't like it, but somebody else does. And more into the nature of why we read and how we read and how we approach things. Because it would be easy to just say, like I've said a million times, it's not for me, and move on. Or to just say, I don't like it, so I'm not going to read it. But like I said, I read Solenoid twice. I've gotten more than halfway through Blinding before making this video, and I really wanted to make this video because I'm struggling to sort of find the motivation to continue Blinding, even if already there are some images in the book and some moments that feel really engraved in my mind. And it's just the thing that really is so fascinating isn't the book itself to me, but my reaction to the book, even at the same time as I'm questioning continuing the book. And it's that conflict, because to me, really, the experience of reading Blinding is a similar experience to listen. When I was a little kid, my great-grandmother, I would stay at my great-grandmother's house after school because both my parents worked, and my father would come to pick me up. And as he comes in, my great-grandmother, being somebody in her late 80s, likes to talk, as most elderly people do. And as with most elderly people, she talks a lot, and she goes on tangents. So it would literally get to the point where she's he's kind of walking out towards the car, getting in the car, and she'll be knocking on the windshield to say just one more thing. But that just one more thing is sometimes literally a 20-minute story filled with so many tangents, because the story can never just start with the part that she wants to say. She has to build up to it. She has to describe everything. She has to forget where she was. She has to repeat herself a few times. She has to go on these tangents that are so long that by the time she finishes the tangent, she's forgotten where she was even in the story that she wants to say. And when I say that with Karatescu's writing, I don't mean it in a sort of degrading way, but it's a very similar concept of a chapter will have a point, but it'll begin kind of way before that point is reached, and then kind of weave its way. A paragraph can go on for a full page about, and you can have a few paragraphs that are dedicated to something that ultimately doesn't go anywhere. It's just kind of a little side tangent or observation. And then literally one time the tangent went on for so long that the next paragraph abruptly reverted to the thing that was kind of where the plot was going. And I actually had to circle back a few pages to go and remember where I was. And part of that is also just the fact that when you're just hearing so many details over and over and over and over and over, my brain just shuts down. It starts skimming text. It starts skimming pages, because it's not just enough to describe one thing. It's just that thing broken down into a multi-sentence long description of something that I just personally don't find to the point and poignant. But this is a scale, I guess, is where I think I want to sort of argue against this binary concept of like it or don't, where I've read long books that I enjoy, like the Brothers Karamazov, like Anna Karenina and some of Dostoevsky's other works. I've read short books that I enjoy, like Gadsby, which is basically just a novella. I've reviewed a few shorter books that are borderline just novellas for this channel. So it's not the length itself, it's the maximalist style of writing that I just don't gel with. And again, like, prose is so to people's taste. What can be flowery for one person can be really off-putting and almost absurd for another. And it's just this way of describing things to such a refined degree that for me it just causes my brain to shut off. It's like if I was in a class and I was trying to study for a test and a professor spoke this way, I would probably just tune out the majority of what they're saying. And by the end of class, my notes would probably be, just a few sentences of notes really driving at the point of what's going on. But for some people, like I said, this is the exact appeal to the book. And when I made this channel, not really when I made this channel, but what I've talked about kind of in the past with like my Kobo Abe's not Woman in the Dunes, the Ruined Map review, is pushing against some of these narratives around reading. Especially since when it comes to anything, it can become a performative art. Like, okay, let's take video games. Video games should just be fun. Particularly, single-player video games at that. Not even multiplayer games where it's a competition. But a single-player video game, you can have a game like Dark Souls, where it's challenging. Where a lot of people play the game, let's not lie to ourselves, for the sort of bragging rights, for the performative aspect. Then you add social media into the mix, and the dynamics begin to shift, where if you complain about the Dark Souls games, you just need to get good. And you get the get-gooders who will dismiss all criticism. And again, we come back to what I was saying about nuance, where there's really not... Even if you can have somebody who writes up a nuanced post, specifically of why they feel that something is too difficult in a game, a lot of the response will be simplified to get good. And I think you kind of saw this a lot in games with like Hollow Knight, where I was happy to see a bit more nuanced discussion around Hollow Knight, but a lot of it did still boil down to one side is the get good crowd, and the other side is the too hard crowd, without a whole lot of discussion really in between on what makes something difficult, what defines difficulty, and things like that. So that's with a video game, right? Like something that you just play mostly for entertainment. Like, so, but then you take it and you apply it to, let's just call it for the sake of argument, high art, right? Like cinema or literature. And not that video games can or can't be high art. That's a completely different discussion. I'm just saying like something like Hollow Knight is mostly, or Dark Souls really, is mostly trying to be entertaining first. Whereas, you know, it's very different from something like cinema or literature where they're trying to do something more complex, thematic with the resonance that they're trying to leave you with and the thoughts they're trying to give you. That level of performance and performative behavior becomes amplified significantly. And what ends up happening, I think, especially with literature and cinema, part of the appeal to people is the sort of intellectual stigma that becomes, not stigma, the sort of intellectual aura that comes with being engaged in those types of things. And it frustrates me that in a way, even just being a reader, you know, telling people you read books causes people to look at you with a bit of a different way. They tend to think, oh, you're a smarter person. The thing is, I've had people do this to me without even asking what books I read. I could be reading complete nonsense, and they would still, because I'm a quote-unquote reader, look at me differently and treat me differently and think that I'm more intellectual, which, again, I'm not. I have different feelings on reading and, you know, quote-unquote high art versus low art or whatever, reading for entertainment versus reading for thematic value and whatnot. That's not what this is about, but I do believe that there is a divide there. But again, it's more of a scale rather than a binary. Regardless, my point being that you take the intellectual aspect of cinema, of literature, of things like that, and the performative aspect suddenly becomes all the more pronounced, which is why I feel that when it comes to discussing certain books, it becomes almost sacrilege to sort of be critical of them, even in a way which appreciates their good points. So, and I understand it from both sides. I understand it from the perspective of the people who constantly sort of are arguing for the value of literature. I mean, I'm somebody who sits here and tells you that literature is valuable. I'm somebody who thinks that there is a difference between reading Anna Karenina and I'm just going to use Romanticy because it's the current punching bag right now, like Sarah J. Maas, whatever. Again, that's a more complicated issue. We'll get into that later. But there is, to me, a fundamental difference. I don't think that all reading is good reading. You know, for instance, I mentioned Wuthering Heights a while back, or maybe I didn't. You know, and the question is, if you watch Wuthering Heights the movie and you read Wuthering Heights the book, and all you get out of it is what you saw in the movie because you were just looking for confirmation of your own bias, can you really have been said to have read Wuthering Heights, even if your eyes did pass over the words, because you didn't actually engage with the art in a meaningful way? So, obviously, I am somebody who tends towards the more elitist spectrum of things, so I understand this sort of pushback against the mass audience sort of thing, because I do think that if there's not this pushback, if we don't argue for the value of art and these things, then it would become so easy for them to get drowned out in the sort of commercial advertising heavy mass media pop culture bubble that is so predominant. I don't think that shaming is necessarily the right path, but if you don't have an entire group of people repeatedly affirming, claiming, that this is actually better, then you're going to have a harder time drawing people to it. So I understand the pushback against anti-intellectualism and the sort of corporate takeover of everything, and the corporatization of art, even though that has been traditionally a long part of history. But I also get just as frustrated with the other side of things, where if you do have a criticism of something, then it tends to get dismissed as it's too intellectual, it's too difficult for you, you didn't understand it, because again, it's reducing a discussion, a serious discussion, an artistic discussion, down to a single thing, a single element, a single sentence, which is almost more hypocritical coming from quote unquote our side of the equation, because we're supposed to be the people who believe in sort of deep discussion, deep conversation, and to just dismiss people like that so easily, not only does it serve to push them away from reading as a whole, but it creates this atmosphere around reading that I've really been working hard in my real life to kind of push against, where so many people don't even begin because it seems like a challenge that they cannot surmount. A lot of people tell me, like, oh, I want to read, but I don't have time. As though reading means sitting down and opening a book and sitting there until you've read 50 pages, when it's like, just read 10, 20 pages and go do something else and come back and read it again. And, move on with it. Or just read 10, 20 pages a day. Like, you don't need to read X amount. And a lot of them are really kind of surprised to hear this. Like, I didn't think about this, and it seems so obvious to me. But at the same time, you have things like reading challenges, like Goodreads reading challenges, or I read so many books over such and such a period of time. I understand the sort of value that can be gained from tracking your reading, but at the same time, I think it is so easy, and especially in this performative environment, to end up missing the point and missing the benefit in an effort to hit these arbitrary goals that tend to be more about exactly that performative nature. I see a lot of people sharing statistics about how people don't read, and talking about, are you in the 1% because you've read 50 or more books in a year, completely missing the more important and more alarming statistic that fewer than 50% of people have read more than one book in a year. And it's exactly this kind of performative aspect that I want to push back against, and this idea that there is a certain type of maximalist work right now, which, not just right now, but almost in perpetuity, becomes popular. And if you don't like it, if you don't care for it, or if you bounce off of it, there tends to be this argument that, well, it's too deep for you, and you're stupid, or whatever. But as long as you're treating it and engaging with it earnestly, as long as you can sit there and actually have a discussion and list its good points and its bad points, I genuinely think that you have done your part, and you're not less of a reader because you don't particularly gel with the maximalist style. So works like Gravity's Rainbow, works like Infinite Jest, works like Solenoid, John Fosse's The Septology. There's so many of these different works. They're big books, they're thick books, they go on for paragraphs and paragraphs and paragraphs, and a lot of people will tell you, well, if you don't like them, and rather I should say, a lot of people in the literary community will rave about them, and a lot of people will criticize them. And a lot of the people criticizing them will say that they're overstuffed nothing, and a lot of people raving about them will say that they're pushing literature forward and doing things that nobody else has understood. And the thing is, neither side is fully right, the truth lies somewhere in the middle. To dismiss them as simply like completely overwritten intellectual wankery, I think is doing a complete disservice to these authors and their works. But to be critical of sort of the way that they're written and whether or not this particular style is really beneficial is a conversation to be had that often is not a conversation, is not a dialogue, but which gets written off by the other side. I think another example is punctuation. I've seen in works like Cormac McCarthy, or I mentioned septology. Increasingly, there tends to be works that go on for really long paragraphs, or that omit punctuation marks, or that even omit like an 800 page book that's one sentence. And for me, I genuinely to me, punctuation exists to make things easier to read. Making it easier to read is about making it more accessible and making it just not visually more appealing in the sense that, oh, I want to read it, but in the sense that legitimately long paragraphs can give me a headache when the text is small and squished together and not spaced out very well. And giving me quotation marks to indicate when somebody's talking isn't a bad thing. It's not. It's there specifically to make it easier, to make it a more pleasant reading experience, because having to go back and reread something to catch who's talking isn't adding anything to the reading experience for me. Like, granted, it's not like a make or break thing. Like, okay, Cormac McCarthy's lack of punctuation and quotation marks isn't a make or break thing for Blood Meridian, but I certainly, or any of his other works, but I certainly think that it's not helping anything either, and it's a point that complicates the reading process, which for me, you really have to be giving me something out of it. And I'm not on the other end. I think I've mentioned multiple times, as much as I enjoy Jose Saramago, I find his formatting to be counterproductive to the reading experience. Blinding is the only book where I feel like it added something meaningful to it. Otherwise, I find it a frustration and would enjoy his books more without it. But I'm also not going to shut down anybody who disagrees, right away. And again, I circle back to Blinding, Solenoid, and how much I really want to enjoy these books. I really want to connect with them because I feel like behind the prose there is so much that I would enjoy. But the fact of the matter is, the prose is so antithetical to the things that I enjoy that reading it, my brain shuts off. And when I do go back and force myself to reread a passage in depth and in detail, what I come out with at the end of it is not a deeper appreciation for what I just read. It's and it's just like you could have said something similar in fewer words. But I don't want to detract from the people for whom that is the appeal, that is the point. Art is complicated. In one sense, prose is only one element of the book, but it is the element by which we interact and engage with the text. And similar to a movie where there are all sorts of different elements in the performances, in the dress, in the set design, in the music, in the sound design, so on and so forth, at the end of the day, the camera is our lens into the world. And if there's a director that you particularly don't like their style, then everything else can be fantastic, but you can still struggle to enjoy the film. And in some instances, maybe what you find on the other side, you're able to tolerate it to a point where you can ultimately enjoy it. But maybe, as is going to be the case most of the time, it ends up being impossible to enjoy the film, even if everything else is right up your alley, simply because of the way it's directed. And that's where I'm left with Blinding, with Solenoid, with maximalist works in general. I don't think they're bad books. I don't think that everybody who claims to love them is full of shit. That's certainly not it. but I also recognize that there is this performative element to art. And I just want to sort of argue this middle ground of there's value to these books. They are good books, but they're not books for everyone. And I think that having the conversation, having the dialogue is valuable if it's a conversation, if it's a dialogue. I feel like my constant struggle to engage with this work, to understand this work, to figure out why it's not appealing to me in the way that it should, which required reading Solenoid twice and coming back to Blinding. I feel at the end of it like I have a better understanding of myself and the way I engage with art and what I'm looking for, not just in art, but in the world at large. So there is value to the conversation. There is value to the struggle. Just make sure it's conversation. Make sure it's a dialogue. Even if it's just a dialogue with yourself, trying to figure out why things make you feel a certain way, take that challenge. It's absolutely worth it. So join me next time when I'm going to dive into a guilty pleasure of mine, something that I don't think is particularly deep, but which I do enjoy just for the sort of writing and whimsy, kind of the antithetical Caratescu. So see you then.